that I did in the past. When it comes to jokes. Well, I was right in the middle of it. So. Pardon?
Are they still on?
Oh yeah, they've never made more money.
Really?
Yeah, I see them frequently, or I see Tom frequently, and because that recording studio that I used to own with him, he's turned the whole complex into Tom Central, and so everybody's offices are there. Yeah, and so when I go to the studio, which is frequently, they're there. And, well, some part of it is there. And it's like this secret thing now because they're in the market here, but they don't have much market share here, but they're everywhere else. 200 and some markets, and he said ad time has never been more lucrative. They're just killing it. Yeah.
So is Christy Lee still part of her?
Yeah, it's the same. Yeah, they're all equally insecure. I mean, it's like, they're all my age. They're too old to be doing this, first off, and talking about what they talk about. And it's just silly. It's like, no, guys, no, grow up.
Yeah.
But that doesn't help when I say.
14-year-olds, how can we?
Well, that's the thing, and we'll start here. They say, tell me my audience, and I can write jokes for it. Just tell me my audience. But then when they find out who their audience is, they go, I don't want to write jokes for those people, but that's who they have to write. I told you, I was at the track with him one time back when I was working for the show, and at the 500, and we did the morning thing, and then we were out walking around, and Tom goes, can I call a cab and get us out of here? Call a cab. And I said, why? And he goes, because look at these people. I hate these people. And I said, Tom, these are your people. Okay, I'm ready. Tim's done being silly. Okay, thank you. Wow, we have a new sound lady up there. My wife. Believe it or not, guys, Jeff, who usually does the stuff and things, he took his wife to Chicago for a couple of days to just get away. And I'm thinking, where are your priorities? Like my class or having a long weekend in Chicago with your bride? Or a few days. I don't know how long. He didn't even give me enough details to know. But so Cindy's running this, and apparently Jennifer is running sound. So, yeah. So is everybody okay? We ready for this? I came prepared to do about 4 verses. So, wait, what's going on? Now listen, you cannot be a weasel up there. If you're going to sit up there, you can't do that. I can talk to her but she's just so much trouble. You see what I live with? I love her more than a man should be able to love a woman. I do. But see? No more, because we got serious things to talk about here. Sheesh. I forgot what I was going to say. I guess we'll just pray and get going, okay? Maybe if I pray, my wife will settle down. Okay. Lord, I am thankful for everyone here, for those who will watch later online, and those who are watching online. And we thank you for the opportunity for all of us to look into your word tonight and to hear what you have to say to us through this passage. I pray that you will guide what I say and that what we learn tonight will help us to understand your heart better and make it so that we will want to follow you even with a deeper sense of love for all that you've done for us. So I thank you for this time. In Jesus' name I pray these things. Amen. I know what I was going to tell you. Can I just tell you one quick thing about today? We have a young, I don't know how old he is, but he's young. He seemed young to me, but everybody seems young to me. But he has cerebral palsy, and he's a scholar, a biblical scholar, and he's doing some sort of work with disabilities and such. And Grace Church is like on the forefront. He says he's been to literally every church in the country and seen what kind of disabilities, ministries, things like that. And he says we're way ahead of everybody. But he did say that he's gathering some data on things, and he's talking with us. And I just have to say, his Greek is amazing, and he was parsing some scripture with us, and he and I got into an esoteric discussion about genitives, and the whole rest of the lead team just sort of blanked out. But it was one of the most wonderful, because I would say something to him, and then he would say something to me, and we were talking about introductory participial phrases and how we were talking, like really talking, and I don't get to do that very often. But the truth is that he was going like, I'm gonna use, and he has trouble speaking, but you know that his brain is just 100% and 150%. He was just like on it, and he was like, I'm gonna use what you just told me. And I said, well, I never thought about that, but if you take the and we were just having this thing, and I gotta say, when it was over, it was one of the few times I've almost been in tears, just thankful that I've been given the privilege of being able to understand this stuff so that I could have this conversation with this man, that he's making a difference in the disability world because he goes to churches and he talks to them about how they approach disability, people with disabilities, and he's not without what we would say a disability. And it was just moving to me that I could do that with him. Does that make sense? What a gift that I've been given, that the church has made it possible for me to be able to know these things. And he was as equally taken aback by the conversation. So we're going to get together and talk about the word dunamis sometime soon, because we both hit on that, and he's like, I said, I've done a lot of study on that word. And he's like, you have? And I was like, yeah. And he says, well, we've got to get together. And I'm thinking, yes. Because, who do I get to go have coffee with and talk about dunamis with? Anyway, on we go. We're in Mark chapter 13, verse 4. We're in the middle of last week we just got the introductory part to this long, long passage of Jesus talking about the future, or warning the disciples about something that's coming. And I'm going to read, since I'm going to talk about, I need to talk a little bit about verse 4, but I'll read down through as far as I brought notes. And I only brought those notes because it's like 20-some pages, and I just didn't think I would get past that. But it says this: as Jesus was leaving the temple that day, one of his disciples said, "Teacher, look at these magnificent buildings. Look at the impressive stones in the walls." And Jesus replied, "Yes, look at these great buildings, but they will be completely demolished. Not one stone will be left on top of another." Later, Jesus sat on the Mount of Olives across the valley from the temple. Peter, James, John, and Andrew came to him privately and asked him, "Tell us, when will all this happen?" Tell us, when will all this happen? What sign will show us that these things are about to be fulfilled? And Jesus replied, "Don't let anyone mislead you, for many will come in my name, claiming I am the Messiah. They will deceive many. And you will hear of wars and threats of wars, but don't panic. Yes, these things must take place, but the end won't follow immediately. Nation will go to war against nation, and kingdom against kingdom. There will be earthquakes in many parts of the world, as well as famines. But this is only the first of the birth pains, with more to come. And when these things begin to happen, watch out. You will be handed over to the local councils and beaten in the synagogues. You will stand trial before governors and kings because you are my followers. But this will be your opportunity to tell them about me. Now, I just want to say that when the disciples said to Jesus, tell us when these things are going to happen, one interesting aspect of this is that it's clear that they believed Jesus knew what he was talking about. That they were confident that when he said that this was going to happen, that it was going to happen because Jesus said it. And that's a strong point that they would go to him and say that. There are two questions. I just want to go back over them. I know I talked about them last time. Tell us when these things will happen. That's exactly what it says in the Greek. When will these things happen? And by the way, this entire passage is anchored by one word. The word is tauto, and it's the word that gives us these things. These things that, there we go. Oh, no, that's later. That's later on. Don't be misled. Yeah, that's later. Anyway, we can go back to the text. This word, these things, they say, tell us when these things will happen. Tell us what the sign, singular, which is interesting. Now, did I talk about that last week, that it was singular? I'll talk about that in a second. And they go, tell us the sign that these things are about to be fulfilled. And then Jesus uses the term about 4 times in it, referencing what he's talking about as these things. And at the end of the whole passage, he says, I've told you all things, just another form of the word, all things. And so we need to know what they mean by these things, because that word flows through this whole passage and ties it all together, because we're looking at, and I just have to say that this is a common word that's used in Jewish prophetic writings, and I'm not talking necessarily biblical, because there's tons of Jewish prophetic writings that go along with this time period that are not in the scripture. But they're always talking about these things, and they're always talking about them in the sense of these things that must happen. Okay? It's these things that must happen. So when they say this, tell us when, and of course NLT says when all this will happen. It should say when these things will happen, if they want to actually follow the Greek. What sign will show us that these things are about to be fulfilled? They're thinking immediately back to all the prophetic stuff, and they are really confident that Jesus can tell them about it, because he wouldn't know that these things are going to happen if he hadn't been told by somebody that was making it. You're catching what I'm saying? I know this is kind of complicated, but I just want us all to remember that once Jesus goes down this road with them, they ask because they believe him, and he tells them because they believe him. Does that make sense? Does that make sense? And what he's going to tell them are things that must happen, because it's all in this prophetic space. Now, I know that's kind of complicated, but I just want you to know that Jesus he did not sit them down and say, I have some things I need to tell you. They asked him, and so he told them. And that has to do with his knowing that they what? Believed him. Because he knew all along what was coming. It must be. That's what the Greek literally says. These things must be. We'll get to that in a minute. So anyway, that was a long way to get to. I'm sorry if that was confusing. It's just that they wanted to know, and I said this last week, I know this, that their questions were asked because they wanted to know whether they needed to worry about it or their kids needed to worry about it or their grandkids needed to worry about it. And the truth is that most prophetic utterances about these things from the stuff that, and I know this sounds weird, but there's an awful lot at this time swirling in their world. There are an awful lot of Jewish prophetic writings about the end of time. And their question, when they asked about these things, that phrase was, this is not complicated, but I'm probably making it complicated. That phrase represented this. Three aspects of these things. What is going to tell you that something is coming? The things that tell you that something is coming. Those are some of these things. The prophet then tells you what's coming. That's part of these things. Then the prophet tells you what it will be like after this happens. Now, if you think about the prophetic word in the Old Testament, when the prophets were talking to the Jews about, they would say, this is a sign that this is coming, this will happen, and this is what will come out of it. Okay? That's the prophetic pattern of these things that must happen. These things show us they must happen so people are warned. These things happen because they needed to happen, and then there is some kind of restitution at the end. These things also must happen, and they all show us one thing. They all show us one thing, that God is in control. He makes these things happen so his people are warned. He makes these things happen because they need to happen. Destruction needs to happen, or some enemy needs to be defeated, or something needs to happen. And then God redeems this mess, and everything, he brings his people back to him. Does this make sense? I just want to make sure I'm making sense here. This is what these guys are asking him the questions about, because they want to know what's coming. They've already been told what's going to happen, and they already thought they knew what the end was going to be, because they thought Jesus was going to do what? Jesus was going to be the Messiah, and he was going to conquer everything, and he was going to enter into the kingdom of God, and the last thing they could imagine was that there was some end point out here that didn't include the thing that Jesus just told them was going to be destroyed. Because the temple is the center of everything to them. And so they couldn't, this is like completely off of their radar. Their entire thought process about what the end is going to look like has to change, because there's no longer any temple to bring center to what the Jews were thinking was going to happen. God was going to live in that temple. He was going to fill the Holy of Holies again. And he could, because the Messiah had cleaned everything up. And the Messiah had made it possible for God to live and dwell with his people forever. And also remember that when those guys are thinking about Jesus being the Messiah, you know, if they're saying, they're asking, is this going to happen in your day, Jesus? But from that point, right then on for eternity, was what they thought Jesus' day was going to be. Because he was bringing in what? The everlasting kingdom of God. Can you imagine how crazy this would have been for them, for Jesus to say, and we're going to tear it all down. Or somebody's going to tear it all down. And so they want to know, wait a minute, you know, it's just like, because they couldn't imagine anybody but the Romans being powerful enough to do it. But that just wasn't on their radar at all. So this is a really interesting moment. Now, Jesus is going to answer their questions in a roundabout way. He's mostly going to talk about them being vigilant and faithful and, well, cautious. That's what he's going to talk about. But he is going to answer their questions about when will this happen and what are the signs. Now, the interesting thing in their question is they say the sign. The sign, singular. Almost all big events in the Old Testament have like a singular celestial sign. Like, well, let's talk about Jesus' birth. What's the big celestial sign with Jesus' birth? The star that they followed is one sign. And it's an unusual thing. It's like and in the Old Testament, you'll see the moon turned blood red, right? That's a warning that something's coming. The moon turns red, or this happens, or that happens. It's all singular. Something that's really out of the ordinary. What Jesus is about to do is he's about to list out almost every possible sign that was given in their world, and he's just going to negate them all as being the one that's going to tell them what's happening. Okay, he's going to do most of it. Is everybody with me? This is a very complicated passage. Most of the time, in modern churches, evangelical churches, they try to make it part of Revelation. They try to dump it, especially the back part where you see the fig tree. How many of you remember, listen to me, I'm too old for you to remember. Back when I was in my 20s, it was all about the fact that the fig tree, you see the fig tree doing, because this is at the end of this passage. So everybody thought they were seeing the signs. Because they were seeing what? Wars and rumors of wars and famines and earthquakes and stuff like that. So they thought those were the beginning and that pretty soon Jesus was coming back. I don't think this passage has anything to do necessarily about Jesus coming back. I think it has to do with the destruction of the temple. If I'm wrong, Jesus will correct me when I see him face to face. But anyway, let's get back into the text. Was that okay what I just said? Is everybody with me? Because this is like really important background of what's happening here, because everything in their minds is relating to something that Jesus isn't talking about at all. He's got to change their thinking. So anyway, he says, let me get my note. He begins this, and I think I said this. He says, the first word, and I want to look at my Greek real quickly here. It says, and Jesus began to say to them, or Jesus replied, and the first word is blapete. Did I talk about that? That it means watch out, look out. Don't be taken aback. That's his first word. He's going to say that word 4 times. 4 times in this. It's just look out. Is it up there now? Let's see. Yeah, and Jesus said to them, or Jesus began to say to them. There it is, up there. Yeah, that one. Don't let anyone mislead you. His first words of warning are that people, and the word is really the word that says mislead you. It's sometimes translated deceive you. The Greek word actually, it's planao. Let me see if that's what it says. Yeah, there it is. See it? Up there. Well, the form is planese. But it means to roam. It means to wander off the path. It means to be in error because you're just not paying attention. That's what it means. And so what Jesus' first concern for his disciples, knowing that this is like we're in the last week of his life, he knows he's going to be gone pretty soon. And so his first concern is that there are going to be people who are going to lead them away from the truth. He says, do not let anyone mislead you. And he says, for many will come in my name claiming I am. And that is really strong, because what was happening at the time was that everybody was what? Looking for the Messiah. Everybody was expecting somebody to show up, and they're ready for it. And when he says claiming or coming in my name, meaning Jesus' name, and claiming I am, now the Messiah is not in the text, but it's just claiming I am or saying I am. Now this is important. You know what the ego eimi, the word, have you heard that phrase before? Ego eimi? Any of you heard that? That's the Greek for I am. And in the Greek version of the Old Testament, when Moses said to God, what do I tell the people your name is when I go back and tell them that you sent me to lead them out of slavery? And the response from God to Moses was in the Greek, not in Hebrew, but in the Greek, is ego eimi. Ego eimi is then became a powerful, almost unspeakable way to refer to God the Father. Ego eimi. When Jesus is asked if he's the Messiah if he's claiming to be the Messiah by the high priest, when they're just about to kill him, they say, "Are you the chosen one?" And he says, "What? Ego eimi." And of course, what does the high priest do? He rips his robe open, and everybody falls out and go, "Kill him." Kill him, because he just used the name of God to refer to himself. Jesus says, what's going to happen is that people are going to come along and they're going to use me as their, what's the right word? They're going to get their credibility because they've had something to do with me, but they're not going to say that I was anybody. They're going to say that they are ego eimi. And they're going to deceive people because they're going to make a claim about having what? Deity. Or some connection to the Godhead because they have a connection to me. And can you put that back up for the text back up for me there, Cindy? Where it says, the verse that we just... Many will, saying, I am he, I am many, they will mislead. And Jesus is saying, look, these guys are going to be really good. They're going to deceive you. You're going to be easily what? The same, made to wander off, made to roam out into something where you're not paying attention to the truth. Jesus' first concern for the disciples is, he doesn't say when something's going to happen. He says, no matter what happens, be sure that you don't get taken in because they'll fool you. They will fool you. And he says they will deceive many. I got a list here. Where is it? Let's see. Here it is. Josephus himself, you guys ever read Josephus? If you really ever want to get to sleep quickly, I recommend Josephus. Anyway, he wrote a lot of history of the time. And he tells us about, and if you want the record, I have the references in Josephus, but he tells us about a guy named Theudas who came claiming to be the Messiah. About the time, just a little bit after Jesus, the sons of Judas of Galilee. That's a weird one because there's like a bunch of them and they all kind of work together to claim that they were the Messiah together, sort of thing. These sons of... When you hear the name Judas, don't worry. Did you know that like 1 out of 5 men were named Judas in that time? And like all the rest were named John, but the name Judas fell out of favor rather quickly after about 33 AD. I was just, for some reason. And then there's a guy who's called the Egyptian, and he's only ever referred to as the Egyptian, and he came claiming to be the Messiah. And then there's also a guy who's 2nd century. He's like after the 1st century, but he's right in the first part of the 2nd century. And I forget what was his name. He was heralded by one of the his name was Bar Kokhba. That's what his name was. And he was heralded by the top high priest at the time. His name was Rabbi Akiba. And Rabbi Akiba said that he was the Messiah. Now, I just want you to know what happened to all these people. They would come and claim to be the Messiah and gather great followings because it had all been told that Jesus was not the Messiah, that he died and that they'd stolen his body and that he couldn't possibly be the Messiah, and that the disciples had stolen his body. And so these guys come along and they get a bunch of followers, and the Romans hear about it and they go, this is kind of the last thing we need right now. So with a couple of these guys, what they did was they gave them permission to have great big rallies down by the Jordan. And so once they all got down there, the Romans just came in on around like this and just killed them all because they couldn't get across the river. They killed them all, thousands. And the rest of them, they would just make the other guys, they would kill the leaders in such a horrific manner that people who were following them would decide it might be a good idea to stop worrying about following them anymore. Now, there's something in that for us, because the Romans killed Jesus in one of the most horrific manners possible. And his followers, rather than abandon him, because of the word of about 400 people who said they saw him alive, chose to remain his followers. There's a huge difference between the followers of all of these other people and the followers of Jesus. That the followers of Jesus were willing to continue on and do whatever it took to spread the news of this. The other guys, once they'd killed them off, once the Romans took care of them, the whole movement fell off the map. You can read about it in Josephus. He's rather cryptic, but you can get the point. There is one line in Josephus, and I want you to know this. Out of nowhere, it says like, because he's always just writing history, and it's really dry. And then out of nowhere it says, and then there was the moment when Jesus of Nazareth came and he was the Son of God. And there's nothing else. It's something like that in Josephus. And everybody goes, see, Josephus knew the truth about Jesus, but the truth is I think somebody added that about 700 or 800 years later, and so it's like, I don't know that that's really part of the text. But anyway, he did tell us about all these guys who came on the scene just as Jesus said. And that's why he says, don't let anybody mislead you, because, this would be a good thing if you had been following Jesus and then he gets crucified and people say he rose from the dead and then somebody comes along, you're not sure about it. You live in Galilee and you heard about it. And then some guy comes along and says, listen, I was with Jesus. And I have right straight from him, I got the authority to move into this position that I'm supposed to take, which is I am the Messiah. And he uses the language. And it'd be really easy for people to go, yes, this is the next thing. And Jesus says, don't pay any attention to it. Because these people are people will wander off. And the end result from wandering off, generally in Israel at the time, was that the Romans would kill you eventually. So anyway, on we go. He says then, and you will hear of wars and threats of wars, but don't panic. Now, the reason Jesus mentions this is because these are events, wars and rumors of wars, are events that many of the intertestamental prophetic writers mentioned, that there's going to be this battle and this battle and these and this and this and that. And so everybody was looking for this to happen. I will say this, that if you hear, let's say you hear the rumor of a war, I mean, that's kind of weird for us, but let's just say you hear that there's a large army of people that you know hate us, and they're currently in Anderson to the west. What is your general response to hearing that there's a large army of people who hate us, and they're in Anderson and they're moving to the west? You get what? Nervous about it. The word there in the Greek is actually, it's threo, and it does mean to panic or to be disturbed. It actually means to cry out loud in distress. That's what it means, just to like get just freaked out. He says, if you start hearing about wars and rumors of wars, don't panic. Because what everybody's thinking is, if there are wars breaking out here and here and here and here, the end must be coming because chaos is taking over. And he says, people are going to tell you that what's happening is going to bring about the end. He's saying, please don't panic on that one. Please don't panic on that one. Why? Because these things just, actually what he's going to talk about is he says, nation will go to war against nation. Nations are, the word is ethnos. We get the word ethnic or ethnicity from it. Nations in their world are people groups who have a common culture and history. Okay? That means, he says, yeah, one group is going to hate another group because they have clashes in culture, and they're going to hate each other, and they're going to go to war with each other. Yeah, nations will go to, now actually, and it says kingdom against kingdom. A couple of things I need to tell you about this. Kingdoms are political units. Like the Roman Empire is a kingdom. The Assyrian Empire is a kingdom. So what you have is, he says, yeah, people groups are going to go to war against people groups. And big political groups are going to go to war against, you're going to hear about this. Interestingly, this entire passage where it talks about nations going to war against nations and kingdoms against kingdoms is all in the passive, which means that they do this not because they are acting on their own behalf, but they are caused to do this by some other force that is bigger than they are. It happens to them that nations go against nations and kingdoms go against kingdoms, which is implying in the Greek that somebody bigger than the nations and bigger than the kingdoms is causing them to do this. They are passively, just catch what I'm saying here? And this is a sign from Jesus himself, and the only person that I can think of is that this might just be an act of God, that he's moving these things around for reasons that are way down the line. Does this make sense? The passive aspect of the language says that they're not actively doing it. They're being directed without any of their own volition. Now, I know that sounds weird, but what Jesus is trying to tell them is, listen, these things are happening in the world. Wars are going to happen. It doesn't mean the end. Just because you hear about all this, it doesn't mean the end is breaking out. And nations are going to rise up against nations. It doesn't mean that the end is coming. And he says, kingdoms, Rome is going to fight against the Goths or something like that. And it's going to be a big deal. But that doesn't mean that the end, that's not necessarily something that says everything's going to end. Because that's what they're worried about. That's what they're worried about, the end. Now, then he says, first he's talked about things that happen between people. Now he's going to talk about events. The first thing he talks about is earthquakes. He says there will be earthquakes in many parts of the world. The reason he brings up these is because all kinds of, I talked about astrological signs, all kinds of earthly signs, earthquakes, floods, volcanoes, landslides, anything like this. There's all kinds of natural events that everybody in the ancient world thought was prefacing something horrible coming, something big and horrible. And if they've been told that the temple is going to be completely destroyed, it's probably going to be a great big event that's going to warn everybody about it, because the destruction of the temple is like the biggest thing that could possibly happen in the Jewish world. And so he says, there will be earthquakes, and you're going to hear about them. Truth is that is it Tacitus that was writing in his annals? He lists out a whole bunch of places where there were earthquakes right around this time. And the interesting thing to me is that Tacitus is a Roman historian, and he knew about earthquakes in places all over the empire. So he was hearing about what? Earthquakes. And so the word does travel that things happen, and you're going to hear about earthquakes happening where? In many parts of the world. I know that in my lifetime, when there were like 2 or 3 earthquakes within like a month on the news, like one in China and one in South America and then one in Indonesia, we're all going, Jesus is coming back. Because the earthquakes are happening, right? I mean, are any of you remember that stuff? I mean, it's like, yeah. I mean, if we lived by the earth, I mean, don't earthquakes happen all the time now? I mean, it's like the earth is quaking all the time. But it's like, the point is that he's telling them, settle down, remain. He's going to eventually just say, remain faithful. All this stuff that everybody else is going to take, like these fake messiahs, they're going to take all the earthquakes and turn it into something that's going to tell you, I know what's coming because there are earthquakes happening. And did you hear about that earthquake in Laodicea that just happened sometime last month? And we just got news that there was an earthquake in Pompeii. And and it's like that. And they're going, the end is coming. The end is coming. And he's going, nah, settle down. And then he goes, as well as famines. Now, famines in the ancient world happened way more frequently than they do in our world. We have a massive food supply chain. They lived on what they grew. Now, I could talk a little bit about the fact that the Egyptians grew way more food than they needed, and they shipped it to other parts of the world, and we could talk about that. But the truth is, for most people, you have too much rain, you're going to have a famine. You have too much drought, you're going to have a famine. Bugs, weed infestation, the things that we don't think about very much, and all kinds of natural things predicate against whether or not you can get a crop. And remember, if you lose a crop this year, you don't get anything for 2 years. Also, the injustice of the food supply system in the ancient world was that people at the very top, they got all they wanted and more, no matter how much shortage there was. And much of the rental for farmland was payment in crop, and it was demanded whether there was enough left over for other people. Famine was tremendously common in places. And we see in the Old Testament often whole populations of people moving. I mean, that's how the Jews got into Egypt. Famine drove them to another place to live. And Jesus goes, there are going to be earthquakes? Yep. And there are also going to be famines. Well, these are things that just happen. And then he says this, and then we'll take a break. He says, this is only the first of the birth pains with more to come. When he says it's the first of the birth pangs or the first of the travail, that's what it really says, he's talking about he's talking about a woman having a baby, and he's talking about the very first inkling that it might be time to have a baby. That's what he's talking about. He's not talking about the last contraction when everybody's yelling push. He's talking about the first little inkling that the time might have come. That's what he's talking about. Now we have to think about this in context. When he talks about this being the birth, he uses that image. And by the way, this is a common image in Jewish prophetic writings to talk about the birth pangs of the Messiah, is what they called it, that which showed us that the Messiah was going to come. But this is not what Jesus is talking about. What he's talking about is these are the very first things that might tell you to just wonder, is this leading us to something big? Women's place in the first century was the primary purpose, and I hate to say this, ladies, but the primary purpose for your existence in the first century was to have babies. Women had no value in the system if they were childless. And women who were childless and married were shamed and felt shame. It was a shame thing to not yet have provided a child. And so the idea of giving birth and having that first baby was always the elimination of shame and also the fulfillment of the purpose of life. Now, where Jesus is going, I know this is going to be wacky, but he's going right straight through time. The destruction of the temple is all about the ending of the sacrificial system. Because what he's going to do on the cross is he's going to bring about the ultimate way to life. And so he's thinking in these long-term things. And when he says these are the first pangs, what he's saying is that once we get through the travail of the birth process, we're going to actually have something that takes away everybody's shame and gives people great purpose and life. That's what happens when it's just faith in Christ on the back end. I know this is complicated a little bit, but is this making sense? Does this make sense? Are you with me on this? And so he's saying, what's happening right now when the world seems to be in rebellion against mankind and has earthquakes and famines, and when people are in rebellion against each other and everything, these are just signs that we need to have something big happen, which is going to go right straight on through, and we're going to have a big birth of something brand new out there. New life is going to come, but in the meantime, in the middle of it somewhere, the temple has to go away because it doesn't have anything to do with where we're going. Now, you with me on that? You with me on that? I just want to make sure you're with me, because this is a hard one to preach. I'm just trying, but this is what this is about. He's saying, this is only the first birth, and there's going to be more stuff is going to happen, but that doesn't mean you need to stop and freak out, panic, and run to the hills and none of that. Don't do any of that stuff, because the temple's going to get destroyed, but that's just in the process of what's happening here, because we got something out there which is exactly what you were created for, and that's going to be that you're going to enter into the kingdom, because and he's all that stuff out there that I'm going to do next week. That's what he's saying. Because he's going to die and rise from the dead within a week of this. You see? You okay with all this? I mean, I feel like I'm wearing you out here. It's a hard one to teach. It's a hard one to teach. I don't believe that he told the disciples this. This is just Tim, okay? I don't think he told the disciples this stuff. And Matthew and Luke both included in their books, it's all in there, in a little different form, but it's all in there. And that it doesn't have anything to do with them. You know, that it's just all prophetic stuff that's out there in the future. It had to do with them, because otherwise they would have gone, what? You know, but here's the thing. Many of the disciples who were hearing this lived long enough to see the destruction of the temple. But they also knew that the destruction of the temple was post what? The resurrection of Jesus. And they also understood that we have to go through this big travail of the destruction of the temple in order to clear the deck so that the only sacrifice that really matters anymore is the one that Jesus did on the cross. That make sense? Okay. It's pretty heavy stuff. Let's take a break. Yeah, am I back on? Yeah. This whole passage is one of those passages where when you study it and you think you got everything figured out and then you try to say it, it's difficult. So, I mean, it is a difficult passage. I want to say one thing about this whole passage before we go any further. This passage, chapter 13, was a great risk for Mark to write. Because anytime that well, let me back up a little bit. There was tons of Jewish literature and writing at the time about the end of things. And they all essentially said the same thing, that there's something coming that was going to overthrow the Romans, and there would be a great exaltation of all things Jewish. And they were apocalyptic in their form, but they were propaganda too, like telling the Jews how great they were and what God was going to do. And there's lots of this going on. The Romans did not really have much time for that kind of writing. If you can imagine, they just didn't like the idea that people were writing about the overthrow of the Roman Empire and the raising up of a Jewish king who would rule the world from Jerusalem. This just didn't sit well with the Romans. They didn't have any particular interest in the Jewish God or the Jewish people because they were the weirdest people on the planet. True. And Mark is writing about the destruction of the Jewish temple, and he's writing at a time when and whether he wrote before the temple was destroyed or after, because there's arguments about that, but it doesn't really matter when he wrote it. He's still writing about something that everybody knows that it's the Romans are going to overthrow it, and the end result of all of this is that in his book is that somebody's going to die at the hands of the Romans and rise from the dead and rule the world. And for him to put this section in there about, particularly if it's it happened, that the Romans are about to tear down our temple and knock every stone over, whether the Romans were going to do it or not, they didn't want people raising a fuss about the fact that the Romans might do this. Apparently, Mark was so convinced that it was important that we hear this that he took the risk. Now, where he did not take the risk, and we'll get to this later, but if you go read the end of Mark, there is almost nothing about the resurrection. It ends suddenly, and they've added those two weird ends on the end, that we know are not real. The book ends that somebody says Jesus is risen, and two women go, uh-oh, and they go and look for somebody to tell that Jesus is risen, but there's not much other stuff that happens. And the reason is that he doesn't want to emphasize at the end of his book that somebody who's going to rule the world has come, because he doesn't want to make the Romans mad. I think that's what's happening here, because he's already got a whole chapter about something that the Romans are going to do or that are going to do that's going to make every Jew in the world upset. And the last thing that the Romans needed, and the last thing Mark wanted to do, was to have somebody that the Romans killed that they were now saying had raised from the dead. There'll be a book out there that talks about that, and they're going to also tear down our temple. That kind of thing. And so Mark even writing it down. Now, clearly, the other gospel writers agreed that it should be in their books, and so they put it in there. But we know that Mark was first, and we know that Peter probably is the one who told him what Jesus said. And Peter must have said it enough that Mark felt we have to put this in there. If he writes it before the destruction of the temple, then he says we have to put it in there because what? Because it's coming. Now here's the deal. These little things that we're talking about might happen. The earthquakes and the famines and all this stuff, that they're not the sign that the end has come, but what they are is a promise that an end is coming. Okay? They are the promise that these things, when these things are happening, it's like when he associates them with birth pangs, then that means that someday, because women do not go into labor and then never, I mean, here's my dad, the OB guy, but am I right that eventually something happens? Eventually something happens. It's you don't go into labor and never, ever, ever have the end result. So what all this is a promise of the future end result. But it's like way at the front end. Jesus is telling them there's a lot's going to happen, and it just happens in regular life. These things that everybody gets worked up about and says the end is coming next week. No, just go on. And he's also now going to turn to something that's even worse. He's not going to talk about the fact that the earth is in rebellion in some manner with its earthquakes and its famines and all that stuff against the depravity of man, which is the way they thought of it, by the way. But it's going to happen to you. Now, can you put the next passage up for me? It's like, when these things begin to happen, there's the word again, blepete, and it says, when these things are happening, it's not just going to be the only thing that's going to happen. And now he's going to tell them, and when you continue to follow me, something else is going to happen, and it's going to be so unexpected and horrendous in your lives that you're going to think there's no possible way that God's not going to come back tomorrow and change this. Okay? Because this is not what, and when he said, take heed, blepete. Yeah. Says, and the next sentence, you will be handed over to the local councils and beaten in the synagogues. I cannot tell you how freaky that would have sounded to the disciples. First off, he changes the pronouns to you, and they're all second person plurals. He's got his finger out and he's going like this. You, and when it says handed over, it's a word that means violently thrown, pushed. Someone will turn on you. Now, this thing about local councils, what this is, synagogues, because they were the central thing in most, if you had 10 adult men over the age of 13, you could form a synagogue. Big cities had lots of synagogues, and they were based on things like people's professions or their wealth, or they were just neighborhood synagogue. They could have synagogues of all sorts based on whatever, as long as they could get 10 men over 13 to start it. And what they became was the center of all social activity. And what they really became was when there was some sort of civic problem or some kind of crime that needed to be judged that could fall under the auspices of the local Jewish leadership, they brought them to the synagogue. It was the place to bring people. And the council that's a specific term that actually means a group of elders or leaders who make the decisions in the community primarily about whether people are breaking the Mosaic law. Okay? And one of the things that they would judge people on is heresy. And now, the Romans did not give any Jews the right to kill somebody. Capital punishment was, the Romans, they kept that one for themselves. Now, I do know that occasionally the Jews would kill people, but they generally did it by pushing them off a cliff and then having a Gentile throw a big stone on their head. And then they'd say he fell off and he was dead. And then they'd come and they'd stone him, which actually meant they would bury him under stones so that his body would be assigned to people not to do what he did. This is what they did. But they were not supposed to do this, But that's how they got away with it. point being, they could not kill people. Thus, when it says you will be handed over to the local synagogues, that means to be judged for whether or not following Jesus is heretical or not, is essentially what it's about. And to stop you from doing it, it says you will be beaten in the synagogues. Not only did they judge people in the synagogues, but they punished them in the synagogues. The Jews allowed, for a person, the rule was, you could whip someone on they called it the breast, but it's the chest, 13 times. You could whip someone on the back 26 times. They beat them with a cat of nine tails is what they use, 9 leather straps, and each strap had pieces of metal embedded into it so that they would whack you and it would stick into your skin and then they would pull it back. And they did it 39 times because the law in the world, I guess, or the understanding was that 40 whacks with a cat of nine tails would kill you. So they did it 39 times. Just one short of death. Now, can you imagine the damage that this would do to you? Now, what Jesus is saying, he says, it really says they, in the Greek, it says they will hand you over to the local councils. Who's the they? The they are other Jews, because no Gentile in town is going to go, let's haul Simon here into the synagogue to have him judged. No, it's going to be Jews. The last thing that the disciples are thinking at this point in time is that the people, the Jews generally, they are going to hand us over to the leadership. The leadership are the people that are causing problems for Jesus. He's only having trouble with Pharisees and Sadducees and scribes and teachers of the law, but the common people love Jesus, and he just says, in the common people, they are going to haul you in to the synagogue and you're going to be beaten. Oh boy. Oh boy. Now, in the mind of the disciples, they've been warned. But just think for a minute. If your neighbors grabbed you and hauled you to someplace and they beat you like that, you'd think that the world was coming apart. Right? And that there's no possibility that God is not going to come back in and take care of this. Jesus says, it's not the end yet. This stuff must happen, is what he says. These things must happen before we get there. Truth is, doesn't Paul say I was beaten 4 times or 3 times? When he says that, that's what he's talking about. He's talking about being whipped that much. You know, it says that Jesus himself, when he was whipped, in fact, you know, he didn't die from the cross. He bled to death. The crucifixion is a bloodless death. You drown in your own body fluids on the cross. They beat him to the point where he was unrecognizable as a man, and he bled to death because his life is in his blood, and he had to lose his life by bleeding to death. Crucifixion, they figured that one out. You didn't lose any blood when they nailed you down because they put it in 2 spaces where they could hold you up, and you would drown in your own body fluids. Jesus died right away because they beat him so much. Now here's the thing. He is telling them exactly what's going to happen to them a week before he has it happen to him. And they're going to remember that they were told that that would happen to them, and they are just what? They are just followers of Jesus, and they should expect, as followers of Jesus, to have the same kinds of things happen to them. And it doesn't mean it's over. It just means this is what happens when you follow me. Next week, they're going to see it happen to him. And then they're going to go, oh, this is what it means to follow Jesus. Does this make sense? This is powerful stuff. It's a good place to stop. It's right where we usually stop. We'll talk about the governors and all that and the kings and stuff next time. But I just want you to know that Jesus is telling them this because it would be very easy for them to assume that the end has come when the world starts falling apart towards them in this manner. And he's, no, this is just the beginning. Just the beginning. We got bigger things to take care of. But in the meantime, if you're going to follow me, don't expect it to go any better for you than it goes for me. Okay, I got through that. Okay. All right, we'll come back to it. We only have like about 30 some more verses of this sermon to do. And I'll see you next week.